Welcome everyone. This is the Spotlight panel on the history and future of the Caucus on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender concerns. I'm David Galunas from Fairfield University. I'd like to start with introducing our panelists. Sitting immediately to my right is Tony Slagle from the University of Puerto Rico, Gus Yep from San Francisco State University, Charles Morris from Boston College, and Larry Gross from the University of Southern California. The panel today, it's a Spotlight panel, part of the 5 Years Out programming for NCA, where we're anticipating 5 years from now, the 100th anniversary of NCA, and we thought it was an appropriate time to reflect on the history of the caucus and its place in NCA, and possibly as well speculate on the future of the caucus. And we're going to start with Charles Morris.
Thanks, David. And thank you, Tony, for the invitation to be on this panel today. 10 years ago this month here in Chicago, I joined Tony Slagle, Larry Gross, and others on an NCA panel entitled The Future of GLBT Studies and Communication. Although the panel itself certainly reflected the hope that there would be a future for such work in the field and that future might be bright, my assessment of the field as I then saw it as a young assistant professor was less than sanguine. To my mind at the time, even granting the important work appearing with some frequency in CSMC and TPQ, there were too few outlets for GLBTQ work. I was also of the opinion that infrastructurally and communally queer people were ghettoized in the field, that the hard labor of achieving the enclaves of the caucus and the division and to grow their membership seemed in a significant sense consummatory. That is, there didn't appear to be a manifest interest in challenging disciplinary heteronormativity writ large. In short, some just-turned 30-year-old gay men are not known for their relentless optimism. I didn't know then the extent to which, if I may paraphrase Sam Cooke and Adam Lambert, that change was going to come. Even a cursory survey across this field reveals evidence that the queer turn with its varied manifestations has been recognized, legitimated, and even rewarded. In the past decade, Glbtq Scholarship has not only proliferated, but is regularly published in the field's best journals and across the range of available journals, and reviewed by more than a token member of an editorial board. Even the comparatively traditional journal Rhetoric and Public Affairs has now published several essays and a special issue on LGBT issues. The Southern Communication Journal recently solicited and published a special issue entitled Queering the South without, the editor has reported, losing many board members to apoplexy. Queer scholars themselves have held or currently hold editorships in the field. Queer titles now appear or are in production in nearly every major book series in communication, and GLBTQ communication scholars are increasingly finding authoritative voice beyond the borders of the discipline. In the past decade, members of the LGBTQ caucus and division, those explicitly doing queer work, have been the recipients of the Irene Koger Award for Distinguished Performance, 4 Golden Monograph Awards, the Lillian Heston Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Performance Studies, the Gerald Miller Dissertation Award, twice the Carl Wallace Young Scholar Award, the Winans-Witchelms Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Rhetoric and Public Address, as well as the Becker and Kibler Awards for Professional Service. This is an impressive list of awards by GLBTQ members and those doing queer work. Last year, queers and their allies successfully staged the NCA Unconvention in San Diego, in conference rooms, at the alternative site, and on the streets, which led in part to the Presidential Task Force on Site Selection, on which Tony Slagle and I served. A task force which affirmed the major charge of the protest: queer bodies within NCA matter, and the body politic of this organization is necessarily a queer matter. The September 2009 issue of Spectra featured a front-page article by Tony Slagle about LGBTQ research in the field, an issue that also included Lester Olson's column for Voices from the Margins series. Who could have predicted to this extent in the field that queer change was going to come? And yet, of course, in reflecting on this occasion both retrospectively and prospectively, we must remain restless. There remains now and always queering to be done. Let me offer just a small number of queer inducements that we might contemplate and enact in the next 5 years and beyond. First and foremost, let's vigilantly remember Gus Yep's observation that heteronormativity is symbolically, discursively, psychically, psychologically, and materially a violent form of social regulation and control. And I don't need to tell this audience that heteronormativity is still very much in fashion and that this field, this organization, manifests heteronormativity in any number of ways that are violent towards its queer membership. Last year's Unconvention protests, for example, revealed the fault lines in the golden state of NCA's gay friendliness, from the upper echelons of management right down to the dues-paying, hotel-staying conferees. In good faith and with goodwill, we can always debate about complex issues, but it must be said that for many, the bottom line of standing in solidarity with GLBT folk was just too much to ask, even for some GLBT people. The now former executive director of NCA had trouble speaking our name in San Diego, and certainly had trouble conjuring queer affirmative principle amid the bureaucratic spin. Doing the right thing by queer people, it seemed, did not come naturally to many of our colleagues. Even as we celebrate the fabulously queer resistance that took place in San Diego, we should never mistake our habitual location as local or its time frame occasional. It is also the case that even with the great strides in every scholarly domain of the field remains intellectually heteronormative. Although I'm sure there are examples from every subdiscipline, just let me briefly offer two examples from my own academic sphere of rhetorical studies. Given its size and scope, with 32 chapters and nearly 700 pages, the Sage Handbook of Rhetorical Studies exemplifies heteronormative neglect. Glbtq Scholarship does not appear anywhere in the table of context or the index of this massive volume. How should one read this absence? If being fair and just, what rationales for this silence, this erasure, would you allow? Likewise, AmericanRhetoric.com, arguably the leading archive for public address pedagogy, is conspicuous for its ongoing omission of texts from GLBT history. The scope and depth of that archive, which houses copious numbers of text canonical to trivial, renders the absence of GLBT discourse violent in implication, if not in intent. Second, we might consider how we ourselves might make more of the next 5 years and beyond, how we might be queerer than we already are. I agree with John Sloop when in a chapter for another recent Sage volume, he observes of, quote, queer approaches to communication. One of the most exciting aspects of this area of work is that it is persistently reflexive about its own assumptions, its own project. In that spirit, we might consider how, as a caucus, as a division, in our own individual projects, we might encourage, support, and spotlight work by and about lesbians, for instance. I went back to an essay by Dorothy Painter included in Jim Chesborough's groundbreaking Gay Speak. In that essay, Painter observes in her opening line, "When first pursuing systematic knowledge concerning a lesbian speech community a number of years ago, I was asked how lesbians identify one another in non-lesbian settings, and my immediate response was, I don't know. I wonder if our spheres are, in some significant sense, non-lesbian settings, and to what extent lesbian identification, which is to say invisibility, often has changed since 1981. We should all take a page from Sarah Schulman. Of course, our ongoing effort to take seriously the challenges of intersectionality, the challenges to account for and struggle with the interanimations and inequities across gender, race, class, ability, and others, across borders, continents, cultures, media, must persist and deepen. We can take heart, for instance, that some have richly answered Larry Gross's 2005 call for transgender studies and the study of queer kids. This weekend, Isaac West of the University of Iowa received the Critical Cultural Division's Dissertation Award for his study of transgender politics. And his partner, Jeffrey Bennett, this evening, will receive the Wallace Award for a body of work that includes queer teenagers. And we must continue to make intradisciplinary connections that will bring queer perspective and collaboration across diverse theoretical, methodological, and textual assumptions and practices. Finally, I'm pleased that both history and future are key terms in the title of this spotlight panel. There are undeniably significant intellectual, social, and political linkages between queer pasts and our queer futures, both in the field, in our classrooms, and beyond. The genealogical work by our panelists and others has been invaluable, and we should give resources and encouragement to Tom Dunn, who has great vision for preserving and making usable the history of the caucus and division. We should also extend and deepen the queer historicist work being done by scholars in the field, recognizing that GLBT history and the queering of historiography, including John Hoffman's recently launched online queer archive, all of which is to say ongoing efforts to create what Judith Halberstam calls queer time, inflects and makes possible every project we engage in and might imagine, as well as our manifold activist interventions. Let me close just by expressing my gratitude for being a part of this inspiring caucus and division, this fabulous panel, and to say how marvelous it has been to witness the queer change that has come and will continue to come. In the words of Sally Miller Gerhardt in her preface, My Trip to Queer, in Queering Theory and Communication, in the spirit of the queer perspective that we embrace, we all are in each other's debt. We cannot get it wrong, and we'll never get it done. Thank you.
Thank you. We now turn to Gus Yep from San Francisco State University. Gus.
Okay, my presentation is going to be a lot more informal. So I'm going to start out with a journey. When I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking about how long I've been a member of this caucus. And I started coming to NCA in 1989, and I have not stopped coming. So it's 20 years since I've been participating at this organization, at this caucus. During this time, I've seen a lot of change, and so I'm going to mention a few. One of the changes that I saw when I first joined, when I was a graduate student in 1989, were the social hours of the caucus. The social hours were usually scheduled off-site or away from the main rooms of the conference, and I noticed one tremendous difference between the participants when you saw them in the actual panels and during the social hour. During the social hour, I saw people a lot more relaxed, laughing, having a good time. In the panels, people put on almost like this visible defensive guard around them. And it was a time that it was difficult to negotiate how we knew each other. People were to ask us, like, how do you know him? And because a lot of people were still protected by the closet. Now you see that the social hour, not this year, but in other times, the social hour has been much more integrated into the conference. So that's a change. Another incident in terms of changes is the process of putting rainbow stickers on people. And you didn't bring them this year, yeah. I was one of those members that had, from time to time, a lot of rainbow stickers, and we just go on to put on people. And a lot of people resisted that idea, like, I take it, but don't put it on my name tag. And people have a lot of that reluctance, again, because of the larger homophobic and heteronormative violent environment that we encounter here being at NCA. Right now, I think the rainbow stickers are much more common, and so there is much more comfort in that sense. Also, being a member of the Legislative Assembly, I've noticed that at times when I announced that I was member of the Gay and Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer division, there were some looks that were a little different than looks that would be given to somebody else who was from the interpersonal division. So those are changes. I wouldn't necessarily call them homophobic, but those are changes that I see. Also, there was one event that happened at this hotel in 1997, and that was the creation of the division. And I want to mark that as a very special occasion, and also a special accomplishment from members of our caucus and other divisions. In 1997, at the Legislative Assembly on a Wednesday afternoon, those long meetings, it was decided that we were going to start a division for the gay and lesbian group, as well as the Asian American group and the Latino group. And so they told us that to start the division, we needed 300 signatures. So essentially, between Wednesday evening and Saturday morning, 8 o'clock, we had to have collected 300 signatures of members to support the creation of that. I happened to be one of those members collecting signatures at midnight by the elevator. People sometimes are at various stages of intoxication when they're going into your rooms. And so to safeguard that we had more than 300 signatures, I think we went way beyond like at least 350, 400 signatures. So on that Saturday, we accomplished what we set out to do, which seemed like an impossible task in 3 days to collect the signatures. So those 3 divisions were created. At that time, when the LGBT, at that time was LGBT division, and then it became LGBTQ last year, there was a distinction between the division and the caucuses. And the division was supposed to focus on research and scholarship, and the caucus on activism and advocacy. And I want to come back to that when I talk about some of the challenges that we're encountering in the discipline. I'm not going to go into the growth of research and scholarship in the discipline because Chuck documented a lot of the changes and the proliferation of that work in the discipline. So let me turn on to some of the challenges that we're encountering. One of the issues that I ongoingly encounter is the split between theory and activism. So there is a lot of talk about, okay, we need to, which one is theory? So theoretical work is given a certain degree of importance. Activism is sometimes set to the margins depending on the group that you're talking with. And in 2008, I wrote an essay calling the need to reconceptualize this split and using the term intervention. I used the example of same-sex marriage as one in which we can make interventions rather than thinking about this binary split in which we're privileging one part of the binary as opposed to the other. We think about interventions then in that way, so a lot of our theoretical research are essentially interventions in some of the domains of the discipline. So I was earlier talking to some interpersonal scholars that are doing critical interpersonal work that wanted to challenge the heteronormativity of interpersonal communication research. And so that is an intervention, but at the same time is scholarship. In 1997, the creation of the division on the one hand further created this split between research and activism by separation of the 2 units. On the other hand, it also created a space for us to have an increased space for dissemination of our work. So by the creation of the division, we had a lot more panels and a lot more space for us to discuss this work. So if we look at then the intricacies between interventions and theory and activism, then we can see that perhaps we need to do away with this binary and think about activism in more global ways rather than thinking about activism in terms of protest. The second challenge that I see in the upcoming years, and this is an issue that we have talked about quite a bit at various kind of informal meetings here, is the need to attract more diversity to our membership. For instance, I was the first person of color to serve a complete term as the chair of the division, and I was the only person of color to receive the Randy Majors Award. And I look at the diversity in terms of composition. I think we need to do better in terms of race, class, and gender. We don't see as many women, and that has been an ongoing issue with us. Transgender presence could be stronger, and people of color presence, as I mentioned. And perhaps what we could do in this instance is for us to think about what is it that we are doing in our discussions in the way that we conduct business that may be marginalizing or not welcoming certain members. The next challenge that I see is for us to look at more work in a transnational context. Increasingly, we see that a lot of sexuality is no longer contained to specific communities or national groups, but is transnational. So we see images of sexual images that we see here are images that we see in other cultural contexts through media, and yet the meanings and how people negotiate those meanings are going to be different. So I think that is a very productive site for us to explore. Another area that I see that is important for us to consider is we have gone from invisibility in the discipline to a pretty high degree of visibility. But for us to take stock in terms of looking at what it means to be visible, what are some of the meanings, and what is it that is being produced. If those messages that we are seeing and products that we are seeing and services that we are seeing catering to the gay and lesbian market, are they creating other types of hierarchies? And here I'm referring to the new homonormativity that we see presenting in our communities for us to explore. For instance, we see a lot of endorsement for same-sex marriage, gay travel and tourism, and we need to look at how same-sex marriage, on the one hand, as a right, and as a queer identified person, I feel that we should all have, but on the other hand, we have to look at this specific relational arrangement and how this relational arrangement may be foreclosing other possibilities of relationships. If you think about the gay liberation movement, in the earlier years, there was a much more radical impulse in terms of creating different life experiments in which we can actualize our potentials in a lot of different ways. And now we are finding ourselves in a much more narrow sense of what we should be as proper gay or queer citizens. And for that, I want to invite all of us to also look at the consequences of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has been pervasive and invisibly working to create a commodification of gay identities that are sold for profit. And in the process of selling for profit, what we're forgetting is visibility does not necessarily equal liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gus. We now go to Tony Slagle.
I want to thank David for organizing this panel and everybody for showing up and all of the participants. It's really a privilege to be here today. As Chuck mentioned, we had the panel that he mentioned, but over the years since I've been a member, there have been a number of various types of panels that have talked about the history or the future or future directions in GLBTQ research. But in some ways, this is a special panel. First of all, it's a spotlight panel, but it's also part of this 5-year out program. And with that in mind, last year was the 30th anniversary of the Caucus on what was originally the Caucus on gay, male, and lesbian concerns, and now is the Caucus on LGBTQ concerns. But I'm going to talk primarily today about the relationship between the Caucus and the association itself, in part because I've been very involved in that, especially in the last couple of years. And I think that it's appropriate for us to think about that. For a little personal history, I've been a member of the Caucus since my very first, what was then SCA convention in 1992, which took place in this very hotel. Seems like everything takes place in this hotel. And while I was not here during the days when I hear some of the more senior members talk about the days when it was never announced where the meeting was, and it was all very, very undercover, the caucus meetings. I can say that I have seen things in this association in that time that if they were to happen today would make us ill. And there are still things that happen in this association that still make us ill. It's only been a year to think back on that. But with that in mind, I want to say that today I'm optimistic. Things aren't perfect, but they are much improved, and I think that things are still improving in the association. Before I do talk about that relationship with the association, I want to expand a little bit on something that Gus talked about, and that is that one of my concerns about the caucus, and I'm bringing it up again because it's a very serious concern, is that I'm concerned that we're not doing a good enough job being inclusive. The fact that all of us sitting at this table are men, the fact that the majority of you sitting in the audience are men is a problem. I will say that I tried so hard to get Sally Miller-Gerhardt to come, and I frankly had no luck in contacting her, but there were several other women that I invited, and they either were not interested or were not available to participate. But it's an ongoing problem. I think that one of the positive actions the caucus has taken to become more inclusive was, frankly, the name change, because I do know that there were members who felt that they were not included when it only included lesbian and gay in the title. I know there were several bisexual members in particular who just frankly said, I don't feel represented. So that was a positive change, but I really would like to see the caucus think long and hard about concrete actions we can take to make our group more inclusive. Yesterday, frankly, was, of all the caucus business meetings I have ever been to, was the one where there were more women there. And I think there was a reason, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So let me talk a little bit about the relationship between the caucus, a little bit about the division, and the association itself. And I want to do this by telling a few stories. I mean, for me, it's largely personal, too. Some of you have heard these stories before, so if you have, bear with me. But some of these stories are new. Some of them happened as recently as this morning. Some of you will remember the membership of what was then the Speech Communication Association. The membership was asked to vote on a constitutional amendment to add the chair of the Affirmative Action Inter-Caucus Committee to what was then, everything's changed, to the Legislative Council. This required a 2/3 vote of the association. This was before the caucus had representation on the Legislative Council as well. That failed, and it was incredibly controversial, and it was all over the issue of adding the chair. There were other things that were part of that amendment. The following year, a group of us met and had a pre-conference, and Gus told the story of creating the division, and so I'm not going to go into that, but one of the things that Gus didn't mention was that people were very reluctant. While they were willing to sign the other two positions, they were very reluctant to sign the Glbt petition. And one of the things I want to say that's interesting about that is that of the identity divisions, the Glbt has the second largest membership, second only to feminist and women's studies, which is huge. But we're very well, we have over, the number last week, I think, was 450 members we now have, so very large division. A few years after the creation of so then the divisions were created, which then gave us 2 votes each on the Legislative Assembly, and a few years after that, Rainey McCarrow led the association through a broad constitutional revision, which then added for the first time a representative from each of the caucuses. And to me, it was growth for the association because the membership then voted on the Constitution, and it really wasn't all that controversial, when just a few years earlier adding 1 chair of the Affirmative Action Committee was much more controversial. I mean, it was still controversial, but not like it was. Just this morning at the Legislative Assembly, I made a motion to ask for amendment to the current Constitution to once again add the chair of the Affirmative Action Inter-Caucus Committee to the Legislative Assembly, which has not been, we have not looked at that since that constitutional amendment failed many years ago. And this was, that passed almost unanimously. So in January, you will all have the opportunity to vote on this. Please vote on this. It's very important. It requires a 2/3 vote of the membership to pass. Okay. Several years ago, when the caucus decided to change its name to add it was the Caucus on Gay and Lesbian Concerns, and to add the other identifiers. This was something that was hugely controversial within the caucus. It's something that we debated for years, very strongly felt opinions about this within the caucus. When the caucus finally voted to change its name, I was the person asked to take this to the Legislative Assembly. When I took it to the Legislative Assembly, I explained to them the history that we had over 2/3 of the caucus had voted to change our name, which was part of part of the bylaws of the caucus at the time. And it was, fireworks were set off. And in particular, there was, I will never forget one woman when she stood up and said, well, does every member of the caucus now feel represented by the new name? And I said, well, as I said, we went through this process. We've gone through what the bylaws are. And I said, and more importantly, a number of members do not feel represented by the current name. I said, this is more inclusive. to which she looked at me and said, "Whatever," and walked away. I'm happy to say that the name change was approved, and she may have been the lone vote against it in the end. But there was a fair amount of hostility. It was either the next year or 2 years later, all the years start to blur together after a while, when the division changed its name. And again, this was taken to the Legislative Assembly. There was some discussion. It was also not very controversial within the division at that point. But it also wasn't very controversial in the Legislative Assembly, and that was done with relative ease as well. So again, baby steps, but I think that things are improving as time goes by. Last example that I want to talk about is what happened last year at the 2008 convention. This is all pretty fresh in our minds, particularly those of us who were quite involved. And while the association in general responded badly to the situation, and we're all well aware of how badly the association reacted to it, I want to talk about some of the positive things that came out of it. I'm trying to remain optimistic today, because I was pretty cynical as a 30-year-old. As a 40-year-old, I'm a little more optimistic. As Chuck mentioned, Art Bachner created a presidential task force on site selection, on which the two of us were members, which resulted in an extensive report that made recommendations to the association about about specific criteria in looking for sites in the future. This was accepted unanimously by the executive committee, and they agreed to put this in place. And the executive committee then, as a result, has created new member working committees. One of those member working committees is the Member Working Committee on the Annual Convention. And that committee is in part charged with taking this report, looking at sites, and making sure that we find sites that are hospitable to our members, and that in efforts to avoid the problems that we faced in San Diego. I'm the chair of this committee, and I can say that I am very happy with the makeup of this committee. We're all very committed to these issues, and we've been working hard. There are other issues we'll be working on as well, but that is certainly a positive outcome of what happened, I think. In addition, I want to say that another thing, I want to give a nod to Art Bachner. I'm very impressed with the way he personally responded to what happened in San Diego. The fact that the division and caucus programs were moved, we would have found a way to move them, but Art actually went out of his way to take money out of his presidential discretionary account over the objections of much of the rest of the executive committee to pay for the rooms for the division and caucus programs. I wish the association would have paid for more rooms, but it was a step in the right direction, and I do think that Art deserves some credit for that. So, what kinds of things can we do to make our lives better in NCA? It might sound cliche, and I've actually said this in a few other sessions at this convention, but I think that it's important that we participate in the process and we get ourselves involved in the leadership whenever we have that opportunity. In particular, there have been resolutions in the last 2 years that have been controversial. Last year, one on convention site selection, and this year, one on torture and extended solitary confinement. The Legislative Assembly has about 200 members, and both of these resolutions failed by 2 votes, which is very disappointing. And the reason is that people don't want to see NCA become a political organization, as if neutrality is not a political position. But it's important that we get people on the Legislative Assembly, because this is the decision-making body in the association, who will vote with us, okay? So we also need to get our members on the executive committee whenever possible, or at least have allies who are not afraid to stand up and be counted on the executive committee. We need to get ourselves on committees, even the award committees. All of these committees are important and give us the opportunity to have a voice and be heard and slowly make these changes in this association. And I also want to say that now is a good time to get on these committees, because I sound like I'm on every committee, but I'm also on the Committee on Committees. John Heineman was also just elected to the Committee on Committees. And so right now we have there's a very queer presence on the Committee on Committees. And actually, what I can say with the current officers that are also on the committee on committees, I feel fairly optimistic about the fact that they will support what our concerns. So I am optimistic, and it'd be interesting to look back at this in another 10 years. Thanks.
And last up is Larry Gross.
Thanks. I think it's important for marginal groups, probably for all groups, certainly for marginal groups, to be aware of their history. History is a resource that is sort of systematically denied to the marginal, and therefore it's up to us, up to marginal groups, to ensure that they have some continuity in history. And this is a very good example, and I think what I've heard already today is a good example of this. What I have to say is really a little bit marginal on the margins here, because I've really been more involved over my time in the field with ICA than with NCA. It's the association that my area of the field has been more engaged with, and I've been involved with ICA for about 40 years, a little more than that. Although, as I realize from some of what I'm hearing today, I may be involved with NCA a little longer than some people, because I remember being in NCA in 1988. I don't remember whether that was the first time. That was in New Orleans. It may have been. And certainly from the time that I began going to NCA, not every year, but increasingly now every year, in part because of my sort of administrative responsibilities, I go every year now for quite a while. But I remember being impressed rather from the beginning by the degree to which there was a queer presence in SCA, in contrast to ICA. I mean, the contrast was striking. The caucus then, and then the division, was impressive, and it was also very clear that there was a kind of engagement and visibility that seemed to arise out of a lot of the work that people in speech did that was just not to be found in the more social sciencey ends that were in ICA, and I think that remains to be the case. So let me sort of recount a little bit, to sort of by contrast, the history in ICA, in part because of that, and thinking, all right, this should be doable. I started raising the question in ICA, and in 1991, 2, somewhere around there, I got the then president of ICA, it was Jay Blumler, to appoint a task force on lesbian and gay concerns, which I co-chaired with Kathy Kirksena. And then the following year, we launched an interest group, lesbian and gay interest group, or whatever, I don't know what it's called now. I'm sure it's got more letters in it. Now, to start an interest group in ICA then, and I don't know what it's up to now, although I should, you needed, I think, 35 or 40 signatures to start an interest group. So we relatively easily got them, and I made sure that there were about 6 former presidents of ICA on the list. So but it was easy to sign up, to approve an interest group. The problem is that remains an interest group. The idea of a division, which in ICA requires, I think it's 200, maybe it's up now. It used to be 200 members. That interest group remains the smallest. If you've sort of looked down the 27 divisions and interest groups or whatever it is in ICA, the GLBT is the smallest and has some difficulty retaining the membership it needs in order to play the kind of role it needs. And there is no caucus equivalent, so it's sort of, to the extent that there's a role there, it plays both of them. And one of the very first things that we did, and I don't remember exactly whether this was the interest group or whether it was just me making trouble, was to ask ICA to adopt a statement of principles, like ethics. I forget exactly the phrase, something of that sort. And I basically took the one that NCA had, or SCA had. I got Jim Chesborough to give me the wording, changed a few things, and introduced it to the board at ICA, and they passed it, they adopted it. What's not to adopt? All this rhetoric about all the good things we do and the bad things we avoid, and our commitment to all these principles. And then after they adopted it, they said, all right, now let's talk about site selection. It says right here. And this was in the era of sodomy laws. So I said, well, it really doesn't make sense for the association to go to a place that criminalizes some of the members. And this was very controversial, and as you can imagine. And I remember one discussion in the board meeting, somebody said, well, next we won't want to go to a place that doesn't have gun control laws. That's an interesting argument. Are you afraid that you won't be able to go out? Are you afraid someone will go out and get a gun and come back and shoot the respondent who trashed their paper? Not quite sure how gun control fit in there, but it's the usual response. Like what's the slippery slope? I mean, it wasn't quite bestiality, but it was they were reaching. But they did agree to it. It sort of was complicated, but they did agree in ICA that they would not go to any states that had sodomy laws. And therefore, after that, for several years, in fact, up until 2003, really, with Lawrence v. Texas, they would call me, and this stopped when Michael Haley took over as executive director because he knew. But Bob Cox, who was there before, would get in touch with me and say, all right, which states are in and which are out? So we'd tell them, all right, which ones had moved from one column to the other. And that was resolved, fortunately for ICA. The Supreme Court took that off the table in 2003. And then Singapore came along. And ICA was deciding, and in fact is going to Singapore in June. It came up, I guess, 3 years ago or 4. These decisions, as you may know, are all made years in advance, and they're complicated contracts, as I'm sure was explained at length last year with San Diego. And they're hard to deal with, they're hard to change, there are all kinds of reasons. And when Singapore came up, there was the same kind of issue. And frankly, they were in a tough situation. They were committed to going to Asia. They didn't have really good proposals from other places. There were all kinds of reasons. And then, the queers said, well, Singapore has sodomy laws. Isn't that a contradiction? Of course, the problem was no one had really thought about it outside the United States because it had all been within the framework of the United States. And, of course, outside the States, all kinds of issues come up. This was just one of them. And there was a heated debate, and I will grant that there was a heated debate, a lot of controversy. They ended up staying in Singapore, but frankly not because they didn't try and find another alternative. They just couldn't. I mean, there was an attempt to work out something in India, an attempt to work out something in Japan. It just didn't work. But it's clearly going to be an example of these. But the fact is, when you go abroad, there are even more issues that come up, which this is only one. But the lesson at the core of it, in part, is that people are willing to proclaim principles more readily than they are to follow them. And part of the role, I think, or the necessity, is to sort of keep those contradictions alive, because it's always easy to say, we're in favor of this, that, or the other, but not do anything. It comes up a lot in professional associations. I'm old enough, as if I haven't made that clear, to remember debates in professional associations and faculties over whether they should condemn the war in Vietnam. And it was a major split in the American psychological, sociological, anthropological associations. I don't know about ICA, I wasn't there yet, but I was involved in some of these, or university faculties. And I think it's a tricky matter, for organizations to take those positions, but other ones not so much. And I think we need to be clear about it. I think we can all celebrate, and I appreciate the detail of the advances that we've made. But the other thing we've all learned, I hope, particularly in the last few years, is that social change is not unidirectional. And what you think you've accomplished with very hard work can also disappear. And if you haven't noticed it in professional associations, I hope you've noticed it in the wider public sphere in which we now have, I don't know, we're up to 30-something examples of states taking away rights at the ballot box, rolling back rights, Proposition 8 and now Maine, and a federal government, an administration that proclaims its support while doing nothing, and its nothing is actually helping the opposition. It's not that it goes unnoticed. That kind of support is easily read as insincere or meaningless. So we're in a tricky situation. I think, as I think the rest of us up here do, think that we're winning slowly and with reversals, and I think we're winning in part because of a different version of what in other parts of the world is called the demographic factor, which is all of the data that we have on public opinion, on polls and everything else, shows that age is becoming a significant factor. It outweighs religion, it outweighs education in predicting attitudes, and age only goes in one direction. I wouldn't overdo the optimism, because as people get older, they often change their attitudes too. But I think we're on the right side, and that leads me to one last point here, which I think is relevant to the association, and it's relevant to our lives for most of the year, not only when we come to conferences, which is that whoever reads what we write, the one audience that all of us, assuming we're all in the academic world here, know we have is our students. And whatever we do as professionals in these associations, and I think it's really important, and I think it's an important way to change through influencing other people who teach and who write. But we're teachers who reach an audience, and being open and raising these issues and putting them in a context which doesn't have to be advocacy, although it can be, but it certainly can be exemplification and using examples and bringing them in and bringing the current events that are going on and that our students are well aware of into the context. I mean, in communication is a field in which it's hard not to be able to do this in almost any area. So that part of what we need to do is move on the level of the profession, but we also need to move on the level of what we do in our regular lives as teachers, as scholars, and to push this publicly. And there, I think we do confront a challenge, and several people, Gus certainly has mentioned it, which is we're at a certain stage of a movement that started out as presenting alternatives and is now trying to be part of the mainstream. And I don't know whether we have to choose between those. We all have our personal things, but they're not the same. And there's been a loss, I think, in the vitality and sort of contribution to be made when the message is let us into the mainstream as opposed to think about alternatives. And if there's anything that a queer caucus can represent and maintain is the importance of alternatives rather than just expanding the mainstream.
Thank you to our panelists. We certainly have time for questions. It's worth noting in terms of preserving history that we're archiving this, both NCA is, and the session will be posted on the Caucus and Division website, which is nca.lgbtq.org. It's a lot of letters and catchy. So this will be on there in audio form and stuff like that. And we certainly have time for questions, and I apologize, it's impossible to see people because we're blinded by some horrible light. But questions, please, or comments.
I'll get things started. Y'all were talking about expanding the membership as far as being more inclusive of everybody. And the question that comes to mind is, do we have any sense of the pool of people that are available to join us, and are any of them feeling, brushed aside, and why? Or they're just populations we'd like to have here, but they're not members of NCA. You know what I'm saying? Like, how does that make sense? Yeah.
I think
I know that there are a lot of lesbians in the association who do not come to the Caucus business meeting. Now, there's one really practical issue, and that's that you can't go to every business meeting, and oftentimes they choose to affiliate with the Women's Caucus, and oftentimes, because NCA seems to be incapable of scheduling appropriately, oftentimes these meetings are all scheduled at the same time, too. That's not always the case, but I do think that people are oftentimes split. But it's also disappointing that they would always choose that over our caucus. And it's also not lost on me when I said that the membership of Glbtq division is the second highest. There's other concerns there too, because that brings up concerns about how white our discipline is. Right. I just wanted to mention that too, because that also was through my mind. I also wanted to mention too that in terms of expanding to trans members, I do have good news, and that is that next year at our convention, we will 100% certain have a gender-neutral restroom available, something we've been fighting for years. In fact, I was told when I brought it up yesterday that they could have one within 5 minutes for me here. There was just no way for me to announce that to people.
So is there a sense for why many women are choosing to go to other division meetings and not to the Glbtq one? Does anyone know? We need to do this.
Well, I can give you two answers to it, which may not be accurate or satisfying. But one is, it helps if you can, which is sort of chicken-egg problem. But at ICA, we have, from the beginning, when we began the interest group, which we managed to maintain, we've had co-chairs. I mean, we built gender parity into the leadership and said we will always have. Now it's gotten a little more complicated because gender identity has become the issue. So, we have male identified, female identified, but it has basically had a co-chair where they alternate as who's, sort of first, second. So in alternate years, you elect a male or female identified co-chair, and then they keep alternating. That helps signal something, and it's one reason why I built it in, as a, when Jay Blumler said he'd appoint a task force, I said, well, make sure we have co-chairs, because I'd seen that in various activist organizations I've been involved with, that if you build it into the structure, it sends a message from the beginning. The other thing I'd say, which may or may not, I don't know how much it accounts for, but Tony already said it, is in my experience of these sorts of things, the conflict or the competition between the sort of feminist women's group and the queer one can be real in terms of limited time, and there's a question of these concerns versus those concerns. So you have a conflict that you don't have on the other side. I mean, there's no equivalent pull.
This was the first year in many years that the Feminist Studies Division and the caucus meeting weren't at the same time. I mean, usually you rank programs in terms of their importance, and everybody puts their business meeting first, so it kind of cancels out business meetings across how they meet. It's just a logistical.
I want to say, to respond to what Larry said, when the caucus was formed, there were also co-chairs. In fact, they weren't even called chairs because they were trying to be so anti-institutional that it was co-contact persons, and one male and one female. And at some point, the caucus decided to change it to co-chairs to be more consistent with NCA governance documents, which talks about chairs, vice chairs, and so forth. And then at some point it just became one chair. And people who've been going to caucus meetings know that for years, this is the first year I haven't actually said something about it. I said, are we trying to alternate male and female? And the last few years people have just said, acted like it was no big deal. I think it is a big deal.
Yeah, I think it builds the point in, so you can't avoid it. Yeah. I actually have a question to Tony, and which is about. If you want to go back.
Add something? Yeah, I think that inter-caucus work is very important for us to get together with other identity divisions and develop some kind of alliance. For example, this year, for the first time in NCA history, the Latina Communication Studies Division had a panel on queer sexuality within that. So if we tap into some of the people, we can and invite them to come in, we can see a growth in membership in that way too.
The representative from the disabilities Caucus came to the Unconvention panel 2 days ago, explicitly to try to create connections with the Glbt division in Caucus, especially in relationship to some of the hostilities that were created on CritNet during the debate about the Unconvention. In some ways, we were Glbt division and Caucus were pitted against the disabilities community in ways that was unfair to both, and so I thought that was very promising.
I think he's a strong ally and has been for years. He's on the Affirmative Action Committee too, which I'm also on. So.
The question I had is whether site selection has come up in the context of San Francisco next year.
Yes. Yeah, and Chuck knows this too, because the task force talked about it. And my recollection of it was, in fact, an argument that I remember making personally is, even with Proposition 8, number one, if we don't go, we're potentially hurting the queer community in San Francisco. By taking our dollars away from them when it's certainly not their fault, and it certainly wasn't San Francisco's fault, the proposition.
No, I agree that San Francisco is certainly not the, shouldn't be the scapegoat here, but it is a difficult, actually the problem, of course, is that if you take the same-sex marriage, amendments around the country, you probably have no place to meet, because it's 30-something states now that have passed it.
And do you punish a state that gave it and then took it away? I mean, is that somehow worse than a state that never even considered having it in the first place? I will say, I don't
know. I'm glad I'm not on your committee.
I'm just, and this is probably silly, I'm a little nervous about San Francisco because the last time when Western was in San Francisco, there was a labor dispute there. We had, which was its own problem because the executive committee of Western wouldn't tell anybody about it. San Diego had its own problems. It seems like every time we go to California, there's something that happens. It just makes me nervous.
Well, ICA after Singapore is going to Boston, where anyone who wants to can go and get married.
I have a question.
Yes.
Each of you mentioned some important political struggles, and I'm sure that they can be quite draining. Is there any advice that you would give to some newly emerging queer scholars on how to keep up that momentum, or something that you said or advice that other people that gave you to keep you in the struggle?
I don't know. You're either the type who does this or you're not. The reality is that there are people who do it and they tend to keep doing it, and there are people who don't and they tend to keep not doing it. I haven't yet found the only exception I found to that is occasionally there are people who don't quite get it until it happens to them, and then they sometimes become more active. But usually it's either the ones who do or the ones who don't. And it's hard to predict. It takes some, you've got to be able to stick to it because, you've heard some examples here of, the things that people say. And if you want to make a difference, you can't always say exactly what you're thinking at the moment you're thinking it, because that tends to be counterproductive. So it does require a certain amount of diplomacy. I have to say, though, for what it's worth, and I said it at the beginning, it always struck me that this association is more open to and friendly to than others that I've seen. I mean, it's partially in the part of the field, the drama club. It tends to sort of, it's less surprising than it would be in some other places. You think this is bad, try the American Economics Association. Ask Deirdre McCloskey about that one.
Other questions?
Can I ask, a lot of you have talked about everything that happens at NCA as an event, as one meeting a year, and kind of how that generally, how the LGBT caucus has been involved with that. And from conversations I've had with people, at least in the earlier days, there were connections between the caucus and people throughout the year as well, too. Whether that was through newsletters or some other form of social networking or things like that. Could you speak to how the caucus has played a role outside of the site-specific things that happened within NCA, and what maybe how those could be utilized in the future in more productive ways?
I think the answer I would give to that, and I think Chuck already talked about it, is publishing. I mean, and the field has become one. I think the journals are open. I think the collections that Gus edited on it. I mean, I think the field that's encompassed here, I think, has become much more open, and it just becomes less notable, which is good. It shows up more, and that's really where it counts. I mean, that's the one that that's relevant to graduate students. It's relevant to junior faculty. What can you do and have it be taken seriously, as opposed to a problem you have to bolster in other ways. So I think that's the real change, and that's the one that you have to maintain because, as I said, things can go the other way.
Right.
It can become less helpful. But there have been editors of journals. I think that's important.
I think one of the things in terms of the journals too that's made it more open, and certainly it's not just this caucus. In fact, I'm not sure how this actually happened. But all of the journal editors every year have to write a report and explain where their members are from, including which units they affiliate with, and in particular which caucuses. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean anything because caucuses are free, and some people just check them all off, in an effort to be supportive. It doesn't necessarily mean that they identify as whatever, but it does make it more open, I think.
I think we need to get more people on specific committees. Pub board is very important. That's when the editors get named, and so we need to have representation. There are committees committee on committees is really the committee within NCA, and it's good to hear that we have 2 members that out of 5?
10.
10.
Time for another question? Anyone? Well, great. Barring no other questions, thank you all, and thank you especially to the panelists for coming out. And you can relive this conversation online in the near future, and we'll see you next year in San Francisco. Thank you.